We're hosting Thanksgiving this year. Many relatives will be coming, so I expect you to prepare the meal all by yourself, okay? My mother-in-law stated dismissively. Huh? Just me? I exclaimed, feeling a wave of disbelief. My belly was already quite big, making every task more of a struggle these days. As the weight of her demand sank in, I realized the impossible feat ahead, preparing a meal for nearly 30 relatives alone. I tried to express my concerns, hoping she'd understand, but my mother-in-law just brushed off my worries. In that moment, I realized I had reached my limit, and it was time to change everything. My name is Nora. I work at an advertising agency and recently married Felix, the man I'd been dating for a year. I met Felix at a house party. I don't usually participate in house parties and such, but at that time, many people around me started getting married, and I was feeling anxious. So I decided to attend a house party that my colleague invited me to. That's where I met Felix. He had a refreshing appearance and could get along with anyone without any barriers. I was never good at interacting with people, and it took me a while to open up to them. I've always been called unsociable, even though I never meant to come across that way. I often had questions like, "Are you angry?" or "Are you in a bad mood?" Even though I didn't intend to, I was perceived as unfriendly, so I never made an effort to expand my social circle. Even at the house party, I couldn't easily fit in and was thinking of leaving early. "Nora, you are really beautiful, you know. You have a sharp and capable air. It's cool," Felix said, looking straight at me. I wasn't used to being complimented, so I was surprised by his words and felt my face getting hot. "Your face is all red," he added, smiling at me. I was completely captivated. From that moment on, he pursued a relationship with me, and after 2 years of dating, we got married. Just recently, we celebrated our wedding anniversary, and we entered our 2nd year of marriage. We both continued working, and our everyday life remained unchanged. Those ordinary days made me happy. On one particular day, both of us had a day off from work, so we decided to go to a nearby cafe. Suddenly, my husband started a serious conversation. "Hey Nora, I have something to talk about." "What's the matter all of a sudden?" I asked, sensing his serious tone. "Do you want to live with my parents?" he asked. "Huh? Live together? Why all of a sudden?" I was taken aback. Honestly, I wasn't keen on the idea. I didn't have a positive image of living together. But Felix continued with a serious face. "Actually, I'm seriously considering getting our own home. I've always wanted to have my own home someday, but my salary isn't that great. And if things continue like this, you'd be the one bearing most of the burden." He suggested living with his parents to save some money before it reached that point. I was left pondering this sudden proposal. I'd heard stories from friends, some having good relationships with their in-laws, others having bad ones. Because I'd heard stories of being mistreated as a daughter-in-law, living together seemed like a daunting prospect. "My parents will think highly of you, Nora, and I believe there are more benefits to living together for our future," Felix said, unusually serious. I didn't realize he had been thinking so seriously about our future. Thinking that way, I felt I should respect my husband's opinion. In reality, my in-laws had never shown any signs of disapproval. When I occasionally visited their home, they welcomed me warmly. Surely, in this day and age, there wouldn't be any malicious mistreatment of a daughter-in-law. That's what I thought at the time. So, I accepted my husband's proposal to live together. He repeatedly thanked me, saying, "Thank you." Thinking about being together with my husband, I was determined to work hard for our own home. But reality wasn't as sweet, and I didn't have to wait long to realize that. As soon as the living together plan was settled, preparations began immediately. Within about a month after I accepted the idea, we were already in the process of moving. On the day of our move, my parents-in-law warmly welcomed us. I knew there would be some adjustments, but I believed we could live together with these people. That's what I thought at the time. After the move, I felt exhausted and unwell. I had taken time off from work for the move, so I planned to sleep in the next morning. However, I was awakened by my mother-in-law's voice. "How long are you going to sleep? Get up quickly and prepare breakfast," she commanded. "Huh? Mother?" I replied groggily. "Starting today, all the household chores in this house are your responsibility. If you slack off, you'll be in trouble," she continued. With those words, my mother-in-law left the room. I checked the clock and realized it was only 5 a.m. I was not feeling well and wanted to rest a bit longer. And did she just say all the household chores? My drowsy mind tried to process everything, but I couldn't make sense of it. Since it was only the second day of living together, I couldn't defy my mother-in-law. So I changed my clothes and went downstairs to start preparing breakfast. But I finished it too quickly. Thinking so, I killed time by looking at my smartphone. Then my mother-in-law appeared. "Hey, what are you slacking off for? Hurry up and get ready," she shouted at me with an intimidating tone. "But it's still only 6 o'clock. Wouldn't it be too early if I finished the preparations now?" I asked hesitantly. "Stop making excuses. If that's the case, come up with more dishes yourself. Finish it by 7 o'clock, she demanded. Even though I had already prepared bacon, scrambled eggs, and toast, it still wasn't enough. Reluctantly, I added one more dish and set the breakfast table so we could start eating by 7 o'clock. However, nobody came at 7 o'clock, and it wasn't until 7:30 that everyone finally gathered. My father-in-law took a sip of soup and frowned, saying, "It's under-seasoned. I can't eat this," he exclaimed indignantly. "Huh? But when I lived with Felix, it always tasted like this," I retorted. "Now that you are part of this family, adjust to our taste," my mother-in-law added. She silently carried her casserole and my father-in-law's soup to the kitchen, dumping the casserole in the trash and pouring the soup down the sink. From then on, with every bite of the food I prepared, they complained. The only things they ate without any complaint were the toast and the peanut butter my mother-in-law took out of the pantry. Immediately after breakfast, I went to my husband's room and confronted him. "Hey, what was that this morning? Why didn't you say anything? It's your fault for upsetting Mom and Dad, isn't it? We just started living together, so get it together," he replied with a sigh. Why should I be blamed? To be honest, that's exactly how I felt. But since we had just started living together, I could only endure it. And so, the bickering from my in-laws continued, and at some point, my husband joined in belittling me. However, one day, something happened. It was about 2 months into our cohabitation. I was concerned about my ongoing health issues since moving in, so I went to see a doctor. To my surprise, I found out that I was pregnant. A glimmer of hope shone through the difficult days I had been experiencing. If they found out that I was pregnant, my in-laws and my husband should be happy. They might accept me as a true member of the family. With these thoughts in mind, I returned home. During dinner, I announced, "I'm pregnant." My mother-in-law, without even looking at me while eating, asked, "What's the gender?" I told her that it was still early and we couldn't know the gender yet. She shrugged, saying, "It's pointless if it's not a boy." The reactions of my in-laws were not what I had expected. I thought that being pregnant and giving birth would make them happy. My common sense was easily shattered. Even after they found out about my pregnancy, the attitude of my in-laws and my husband didn't change. I had expected they would be considerate of my well-being, avoiding any unnecessary physical strain and sharing the household joys. But instead, I continued to wake up at 5 a.m., prepare breakfast, and endure their complaints. Even when I returned from work, I was burdened with all the accumulated household chores. Even when it came to shopping, no matter how heavy the items they asked me to carry, I was always left to handle it alone without any consideration. However, things were still tolerable at that point. When I reached my 7th month of pregnancy, my mother-in-law said something shocking to me. "We're hosting Thanksgiving this year. Many relatives will be coming, so I expect you to prepare the meal all by yourself, okay?" "Huh? Just me?" I exclaimed. That was my immediate reaction. My belly had already grown quite big, making it difficult to carry out normal daily activities. Preparing meals for the whole extended family alone? It was undoubtedly an arduous task, so I tried to convey that it would be too much for me. However, my mother-in-law turned a deaf ear to my pleas and went ahead with the plan. That day was incredibly challenging. I woke up at 4 a.m. to start preparing, making a meal for around 30 relatives all by myself to serve at lunchtime. Occasionally, some relatives offered to help, saying, "Shall I lend a hand?" But my mother-in-law intervened. "Since you joined our family, I want you to do it all by yourself." She selfishly spoke those words, driving the relatives out of the kitchen. I hadn't uttered a single word to that effect. In the end, I poured wine, cleaned up, and everything finally settled down when the day changed. As I finished my bath and took a breather in my room, my mother-in-law entered without even knocking. "From now on, we will host Thanksgiving every year, so it will be your responsibility. Good luck," she said, then left the room. My mother-in-law can barely handle household chores herself, yet she places all the responsibilities on me, while my father-in-law and husband simply look the other way. I've reached my breaking point, and in that moment, I resolved that one day I would get my revenge on this family. Lately, perhaps because I haven't been competing with them, my in-laws have started complaining less, and a few months later, I safely gave birth to a baby boy. "It seems you can be useful occasionally," my mother-in-law remarked in front of me, who had just given birth to a child. Occasionally useful, I thought. Shouldn't she have expressed more words of encouragement? However, at that time, I had already grown cold toward my in-laws and my husband, so I managed to smoothly ignore it without getting annoyed. My parents also came to the hospital and supported me a lot, unlike my in-laws. Feeling that stark difference, I almost burst into tears. If worse comes to worst, I can always go back to my parents' house. With that thought, I naturally felt empowered. Half a year had passed since giving birth to my son and being discharged from the hospital. My son's neck was stable, and childcare was gradually becoming easier. I thought it would be nice to visit my parents' house for the first time in a while, and proposed it to my husband. "I want to visit my parents' house for a bit. Is that okay? If you are busy, I can go alone," I said, trying to gauge his reaction. In truth, I hadn't seen my parents since I gave birth, or rather they hadn't been permitted to see their grandson. Even after I was discharged, my mother-in-law and the others exploited my maternity leave, leaving me with no free time whatsoever. But the response I received from my husband was unbelievable. "Can't you just cut it out?" he snapped. "You just want to go back to your parents and depend on them, don't you?" I replied. "What's wrong with wanting my parents to meet our son? Why is that not allowed?" At this, my husband's attitude turned hostile, and he started shouting, "You are a mother now, so you can't rely on your parents. Stop being needy. I absolutely won't allow you to go back to your parents' house. You should quietly focus on household chores." With those words, he stormed off somewhere. I thought, it's pointless to say anything to this person anymore. Resigned, I reluctantly decided to prepare everything myself. The next morning, my in-laws, seemingly having heard about our conversation from my husband, started with a barrage of snide remarks. "What a stupid daughter-in-law," my mother-in-law muttered, wanting to go back to her parents and rely on them. "Now that you're a mother, you shouldn't have time for such neediness," she concluded. The two of them belittled me together, but I calmly replied without flinching, "Yes, you are right." A few days later, my husband was at work, and my in-laws went out for lunch together. Before leaving, my mother-in-law casually threw out, "Make sure you take care of all the household chores." I had no intention of doing any of it, of course. I had secretly prepared my belongings in advance, and with my baby son in a carrier, I left my in-laws' house and headed straight to my parents' home. Since I hadn't informed my parents in advance, they were very surprised when I suddenly came back. But when my father heard the situation from me, he grew angry, and my mother, while crying, gently hugged me and said, "If you can, stay here as long as you want." In that moment, something inside me snapped, and everything that had been building up poured out as tears. While I was crying, my parents were patting my back. When things calmed down, my son started crying, and we laughed together, saying, "Maybe he's leading the move." Then, after a while, my cell phone rang. It was my mother-in-law. "Hello? Hey, you haven't finished the household chores yet. Where did you go?" she lamented. "I'm not coming back, so don't worry about it." With that, I hung up. She called several more times after that, but I ignored every call. Then, a few hours later, a call came to my parents' house. This time, it was my husband. "Hey, what the hell are you doing? Don't you know what's happening this weekend?" he asked angrily. Yes, this weekend was Thanksgiving, a day when my new relatives would gather. My mother-in-law, who couldn't cook, probably thought that without me, things would be impossible. I could hear her voice behind my husband saying, "Hurry up and come back now." She sounded desperate. "You are my wife, you know," Felix demanded. "Do as I say." Ignoring my husband's words, I hung up the phone and stopped answering calls. A week later, I received a message from one of my husband's relatives, informing me that the Thanksgiving gathering had been a disaster. My mother-in-law had insisted on cooking, resulting in food that was barely edible. When some relatives noticed my absence, they confronted my husband and his parents, exposing the truth, that I had been driven away due to ongoing harassment. The family's behavior was criticized, and their mistreatment of me was identified as the reason for the gathering's failure. As tensions rose, everyone left in the middle of the meal, and soon after, my husband and his parents severed all ties with me. The relatives united and demanded an apology from my husband and his parents on my behalf. Thanks to their support, my husband and his parents came to my parents' home to apologize. "I'm reflecting on my actions. Please give me another chance," my husband pleaded. "It's impossible no matter how much you apologize," my family replied firmly. In the end, we divorced, and I was granted custody of our child. Thanks to the relatives, child support payments were arranged smoothly. While my husband and his parents were the ones with serious issues, the rest of the relatives proved to be truly kind and supportive. When the divorce was finalized, I called to thank them, and they all wished me well, saying, "Be happy and take care." Though I regret being deceived by my husband and his parents, I am deeply grateful to have met such wonderful relatives. My husband and his parents were ultimately abandoned by the family and now live isolated, with no social connections. Meanwhile, I live with my son and parents, enjoying a fulfilling and happy life every day. One day, I hope to repay the kindness of the relatives who supported me. With that in mind, I intend to treasure the happiness they have given me.